At 3:47 a.m. on December 17, 1944, in a frozen forest just outside the Belgian town of Bastogne, a single American infantry platoon transmitted a short radio message to regimental headquarters. The message stated that the platoon was still holding its position. By that point in the Ardennes offensive, that message should not have existed. For more than 72 hours, German armored and infantry units had been advancing through the region with speed and coordination that Allied planners had considered unlikely in winter conditions. Roads were seized, junctions bypassed, and American units cut off before they fully understood what was happening around them. Bastogne itself was already encircled. Smaller formations outside the town were isolated almost immediately. The platoon transmitting from the forest had lost contact with its company early on the first day of the offensive. Its supply route had been severed. Artillery support was unavailable. Air support had been grounded by weather. The radio operator reported that battery power was nearly exhausted and that this transmission might be the last. According to every operational assumption built into Allied planning, a platoon in that position should have been overrun within hours. German doctrine emphasized eliminating isolated pockets quickly to maintain momentum. Cut off. American units were expected to collapse, surrender, or be destroyed before they could meaningfully delay the advance. This platoon had done none of those things. When relief forces reached the area several days later, they found 12 men still alive in a defensive perimeter that had shrunk to less than a football field. Ammunition was nearly gone. Several men were wounded. All were suffering from cold-related injuries. Their radio batteries had failed long before help arrived. They had received no resupply and no reinforcement. Yet the position had not fallen. In after-action reports, the location was mentioned only briefly. It appeared as a delayed clearing operation, a localized resistance point, a minor obstacle that had required additional effort. There was no description of the conditions inside the perimeter, no accounting of how close it came to collapse, and no explanation for why the unit had not disappeared when others like it had. From a distance, the outcome appears simple. A platoon held. The German advance slowed. Allied lines eventually stabilized. From inside the forest, the outcome was anything but simple. The men holding that position did not know relief was coming. They did not know how the battle beyond the tree line was unfolding. They did not know whether their transmissions were being received or ignored. They only knew that the forest was silent in a way that suggested nearby movement, that their weapons were becoming harder to operate in the cold, and that daylight would bring either another probe or a full assault. At the time the final radio message was logged, Allied headquarters assumed it was outdated. Maps already marked the area as lost. Artillery fires had been reassigned. Air missions were planned elsewhere, where resistance was expected to matter more. The platoon did not know this. They continued to hold their ground without any assurance that doing so served a larger purpose. This is not a story about defiance in the abstract. It is a story about how a small unit remained functional after the system around it stopped working, and how survival became a technical problem long before it became a moral one. The terrain surrounding Bastogne in December 1944 offered little advantage to either attacker or defender, but it imposed severe constraints on both. The region was a mix of dense forest, narrow dirt roads, shallow ridgelines, and open fields broken by hedgerows. In summer, visibility along these roads could extend for hundreds of yards. In winter, under snow and low cloud, that visibility collapsed almost entirely. The forest where the platoon was positioned consisted of tightly packed pine and hardwood trees with undergrowth thick enough to limit movement off established paths. Snow lay unevenly on the ground, compacted in some areas and loose in others. Footsteps were audible at distances far greater than visual contact allowed. Sound traveled cleanly in the cold air, while sightlines rarely extended beyond 50 yards. Temperatures dropped well below freezing at night. Daytime thaws were minimal. Foxholes filled with frozen slush rather than water. The ground was too hard to dig deeper positions without tools, and metal tools adhered painfully to bare skin. Gloves reduced dexterity, but removing them risked frostbite within minutes. These conditions degraded both men and equipment. Rifle bolts cycled more slowly. Lubricants thickened. Springs lost responsiveness. Fingers lost fine motor control long before strength was affected. Tasks that required precision, loading magazines, clearing malfunctions, applying bandages, became increasingly difficult as exposure continued. German forces advancing through the area relied heavily on infantry, supported by armor operating along the road network. Tanks moved primarily on established roads, using the forest to conceal approach routes for infantry elements. While armor could not maneuver freely among the trees, its presence shaped American decisions. The sound of engines carried far. Even the possibility of armored movement forced defenders to remain concealed and conserve limited anti-armor weapons. The platoon's position overlooked a secondary road junction. From a map perspective, it was insignificant. From ground level, it controlled a narrow movement corridor used by German patrols probing American lines. The terrain offered concealment, but little protection. There were no prepared fortifications. Defensive positions had been established hastily, often too shallow and poorly sited due to frozen ground and limited time. Supply assumptions collapsed almost immediately. Ammunition resupply had been planned on the expectation of continuous front lines. Once German units penetrated and bypassed American positions, those assumptions no longer applied. The platoon carried only what it had brought: individual small arms ammunition, limited machine gun belts, a handful of grenades, and minimal medical supplies. Rations were reduced early. Water sources froze overnight. Radio communication initially provided a tenuous link to higher headquarters, but cold-drained batteries rapidly. Replacement batteries were unavailable. Each transmission reduced the remaining power. Radio silence became less a tactical choice than a physical limitation. Artillery support existed in theory, but not in practice. Shifting front lines made fire missions risky. Without reliable communication and accurate observation, calling for fire risked striking friendly positions or expending scarce ammunition on empty ground. Many artillery units had already displaced under pressure, further complicating coordination. German tactics emphasized probing rather than immediate assault. Small infantry elements tested American positions at irregular intervals, often at dawn or dusk when light conditions favored the attacker. Full-scale attacks were delayed until resistance could be classified as light, exhausted, or isolated beyond recovery. For the platoon in the forest, this produced prolonged uncertainty. Long periods of silence were punctuated by brief, violent contact. There was no predictable rhythm. Each quiet hour increased tension rather than reducing it. The environment favored attrition. It reduced complex plans to basic constraints: visibility, temperature, ammunition, and time. Any unit that remained functional under these conditions did so by adapting to those constraints rather than attempting to overcome them. This was the tactical reality confronting the platoon as it became isolated, with no clear indication of when or if relief would arrive. The platoon leader was First Lieutenant Andrew Keller, 24 years old, a recent graduate of an officer training program accelerated by wartime demand. Before the war, Keller had grown up in rural Pennsylvania, the son of a machinist who worked irregular shifts repairing industrial equipment. Keller had spent his teenage years assisting in workshops, learning how machinery failed under stress and how small adjustments could keep systems operating longer than expected. He was not an exceptional athlete, nor a particularly charismatic speaker. His evaluations described him as methodical, cautious, and reliable. He followed procedures closely, but he also understood that procedures assumed conditions that did not always exist. Most of the men in the platoon came from similar backgrounds: farm laborers, factory workers, delivery drivers. Few had formal mechanical training, but many were accustomed to physical labor, long hours, and working with equipment that did not always behave as intended. Their skills were practical rather than theoretical. Sergeant Thomas Wilkes, the senior non-commissioned officer, had worked in rail yards before enlisting. He understood schedules, logistics, and the consequences of small delays compounding into larger failures. He had little patience for speculation. His focus remained on what could be controlled in the immediate moment. The platoon's radio operator, Private Joseph Marin, had been a clerk in civilian life. His familiarity with equipment came not from repair work, but from routine maintenance and careful handling. He understood the limitations of the radio set and tracked battery consumption with quiet precision. None of the men had entered the Army expecting prolonged isolation. Their training emphasized coordination, resupply, and support from higher echelons. The idea of operating independently for days without contact was discussed only in abstract terms. Keller understood this gap between training and reality. He did not attempt to inspire through rhetoric. He focused on small decisions: where to position men to maximize overlapping fields of fire, when to rotate watch to conserve energy, how to distribute ammunition so that no single position was exhausted too quickly. The platoon's cohesion did not come from shared ideology or dramatic leadership. It came from familiarity and routine. Men trusted that orders would be practical. They trusted that resources would be managed conservatively. They trusted that no action would be taken without clear necessity. As the days passed and isolation became undeniable, Keller avoided framing the situation in absolute terms. He did not speak of holding at all costs or of last stands. He framed each decision as temporary, subject to revision as conditions changed. This approach reduced panic and preserved flexibility. The men responded not because they believed survival was guaranteed, but because the immediate tasks made sense. Watch assignments were short. Ammunition checks were frequent. Movement was minimized. Noise discipline was enforced not as doctrine, but as survival. Before the encirclement, Keller had been unremarkable. After it, his actions remained consistent with who he had always been: cautious, observant, and unwilling to assume that systems would function as intended. Those traits, shaped long before the war, would prove more relevant than any specific training he had received once the forest closed in and the situation narrowed to what could be seen, heard, and managed within a shrinking perimeter. The moment that defined the platoon was not a single engagement, but the gradual realization that no external solution was arriving in time, and that survival would depend entirely on how well ordinary habits could be adapted to extraordinary conditions. The American infantry platoon operating near Bastogne in December 1944 was never intended to function in isolation. Its effectiveness was built on a larger system designed around layered support, predictable logistics, and continuous communication. Doctrine assumed that platoons held ground as part of a company, companies as part of a battalion, and battalions within a coordinated regimental structure. No single element was meant to stand alone for long. Under normal conditions, the system worked. Platoons reported contact. Companies maneuvered to reinforce weak points. Artillery provided indirect fire when resistance stiffened. Supply units replenished ammunition, food, and medical supplies on a routine schedule. Air support supplemented ground forces when weather permitted. Each component relied on the others to absorb shock and correct failures. That structure assumed several conditions: reliable roads, predictable front lines, functioning communications, and the ability to move forces laterally faster than the enemy could exploit gaps. In the Ardennes in December 1944, those assumptions collapsed almost simultaneously. The German offensive deliberately targeted the seams between American units. Rather than confronting strongpoints head-on, German formations bypassed resistance, severed roads, and isolated forward elements before they fully understood what was happening. Units that remained intact but disconnected quickly found themselves operating outside the framework that gave them meaning. For Lieutenant Keller's platoon, the first failure was communication. Radio contact with company headquarters became intermittent within hours of the initial breakthrough. Battery life shortened in the cold. Antennas iced over. Messages that were transmitted were not always acknowledged. The assumption that information flowed upward and orders flowed downward no longer held. The second failure was logistics. Ammunition resupply schedules were based on predictable expenditure rates during organized combat. Once isolated, the platoon could not replace what it expended. Every round fired reduced future options. Medical supplies were equally limited. Bandages, morphine, and plasma were intended for short-term stabilization before evacuation, not for prolonged care in sub-zero conditions. The third failure was fire support. Artillery doctrine required accurate target identification and secure communication. With shifting front lines and limited observation, calling for fire risked catastrophic error. In practice, the platoon had no artillery support it could safely rely on. Mortar support was equally unavailable. The final failure was mobility. Doctrine assumed that units under pressure could reposition or withdraw to secondary lines. The encirclement eliminated that option. Movement risked detection. Withdrawal risked ambush. The platoon's assigned sector became its only viable location, not because it was ideal, but because leaving it was worse. The system had not been poorly designed. It had been optimized for conditions that no longer existed. What remained was the smallest functional element of that system: a platoon with rifles, limited automatic weapons, and a shrinking pool of supplies. Every higher-level function, reinforcement, resupply, coordinated maneuver, was gone. Doctrine provided no guidance for this state. Manuals assumed either support or surrender, not prolonged autonomous survival. In this gap between design and reality, the platoon was forced to reinterpret its role. It was no longer holding terrain for a coordinated defense. It was delaying movement along a single corridor and preserving its own viability for as long as possible. That shift was not doctrinal. It was pragmatic. The system that was supposed to work had not failed catastrophically. It had simply withdrawn beyond reach. What remained was the responsibility of a few men to decide how much of that system they could recreate on their own, and which parts had to be abandoned entirely. The moment when that reality became unavoidable did not arrive with a dramatic assault or a formal order. It emerged gradually through small observations that accumulated into certainty. By the second night, Keller understood that no immediate relief was coming. Radio contact had ceased entirely. German movement around the perimeter increased rather than decreased. Probing attacks tested positions from multiple directions, not with the intent to overrun, but to measure response times and ammunition expenditure. At that point, Keller faced a decision that doctrine did not clearly address. Option 1 was to attempt a breakout. Under this option, the platoon would move at night, abandon its fixed positions, and attempt to re-establish contact with friendly forces. The advantages were clear. Mobility restored some initiative, and remaining ammunition could be used in motion rather than expended in place. The risks were equally clear. Movement through unfamiliar forest, under snow, with wounded men, risked disintegration. Detection would likely result in immediate engagement without cover. Option 2 was to remain in place. Holding the positions conserved energy, preserved concealment, and leveraged familiarity with terrain. It also risked eventual encirclement tightening to the point where resistance became impossible. Ammunition would continue to diminish. Casualties would accumulate. If the enemy chose to assault decisively, there would be little margin to absorb losses. Neither option offered a favorable outcome. One offered a chance at escape with high immediate risk. The other offered prolonged survival with diminishing long-term prospects. Keller chose to hold. The decision was not framed as a last stand. It was framed as a temporary measure, subject to re-evaluation. Holding allowed the platoon to gather information. It preserved cohesion. It avoided exposing wounded men to movement that could kill them outright. This choice committed the platoon to a defensive posture that prioritized concealment, conservation, and patience. Fire discipline became absolute. Engagements were avoided unless contact was unavoidable. Fields of fire were narrowed to reduce ammunition expenditure. Grenades were reserved for close-range emergencies. The decision also redefined success. The platoon was no longer tasked with repelling the enemy indefinitely. Success became measured in hours rather than days. Each night survived without collapse, extended the window in which external conditions might change. Once the decision was made, it could not be reversed easily. Attempting to move later, under heavier pressure and with fewer resources, would be even more dangerous. The platoon had effectively chosen to anchor itself to the terrain and accept the consequences. This decision did not guarantee survival. It simply delayed failure long enough for other factors, weather, enemy priorities, and broader operational shifts, to potentially intervene. Survival. After the decision to hold depended less on combat prowess than on management of physical limits. The platoon immediately shifted from a conventional defensive posture to a resource preservation model. Ammunition was redistributed so that no single position carried a disproportionate share. Automatic weapons were assigned strict firing limits. Single shots replaced bursts. Suppressive fire was avoided entirely unless contact escalated beyond control. Every discharge was treated as an irreversible cost. Watch schedules were shortened. No man remained on watch long enough for numbness to progress into loss of function. Positions were rotated despite the difficulty, balancing exposure with rest. Sleep occurred in fragments, measured in minutes rather than hours, but it was enforced where possible. Noise discipline was absolute. Movement inside the perimeter was minimized. Equipment was padded with cloth to prevent metal-on-metal contact. Voices were kept low even when no enemy was visible. The forest amplified careless sound. Heat retention became a tactical concern. Fires were impossible. Body heat was conserved through proximity and shared shelter where feasible. Socks were dried inside clothing despite discomfort. Small injuries were treated immediately to prevent infection or frost damage from compounding. Weapon maintenance was simplified. Excess lubrication was removed to prevent freezing. Bolts were cycled periodically to ensure function. Magazines were kept inside clothing to maintain spring tension and reduce brittleness. Wounded men were repositioned toward the center of the perimeter. Their ability to fight was secondary to their ability to remain alive. Medical supplies were rationed carefully. Pain management was minimal, prioritized for preventing shock rather than comfort. German probes were allowed to pass unchallenged if they did not threaten the perimeter directly. Engagements were triggered only when movement approached critical positions. This reduced detection and preserved uncertainty on the enemy's side. The goal was not to repel decisively, but to remain unpredictable. Food intake was reduced deliberately. Hunger was preferable to exhaustion. Water was melted from snow in small quantities using body heat when possible. Dehydration was monitored closely, as it accelerated cold injury and impaired judgment. The platoon tracked time obsessively. Each night survived, altered the strategic context slightly. German units moved past or were redirected. Weather shifted. Pressure elsewhere in the sector influenced enemy priorities. None of these measures ensured survival alone. Together, they slowed the rate at which the platoon's capacity degraded. Survival became a matter of extending that degradation curve long enough for circumstances beyond the perimeter to change. By the third day, the platoon was no longer fighting the enemy directly. It was fighting the cumulative effects of cold, fatigue, and scarcity. The mechanics of survival were no longer tactical in the traditional sense. They were logistical, physiological, and psychological. And they were working, barely. By the fourth day, the cost of holding the position became impossible to ignore. The platoon was still intact, but its capacity to function was visibly eroding. What had begun as calculated conservation turned into enforced limitation. Every action now carried a physical price that could not be recovered. Cold injuries were the most widespread problem. Frostbite appeared first in fingers and toes, then in ears and exposed skin along the face. Men complained less as sensation faded, which made the injuries harder to track. Gloves stiffened with moisture and ice. Boots froze overnight. Socks, no matter how carefully managed, never fully dried. Small cuts split open again as skin lost elasticity in the cold. Wounds sustained earlier, which might have been manageable under normal conditions, worsened. Bandages froze. Blood loss was harder to control. Infection became a serious risk without proper sanitation or antibiotics. Morphine was used sparingly, not for pain, but to prevent shock in the most severe cases. Once administered, it could not be replaced. Fatigue accumulated unevenly. Some men remained alert beyond expectation, driven by tension and routine. Others slowed noticeably, reaction times lengthening, decision-making narrowing. Keller and Sergeant Wilkes monitored this closely, adjusting watch assignments not based on rank or role, but on who could still function at a given moment. Psychological strain manifested quietly. There were no breakdowns, no panic. Instead, men became inward-focused. Conversation dwindled. Humor disappeared. The forest seemed to close in as visibility and options shrank together. Each sound, a branch snapping, snow shifting, triggered heightened response. Adrenaline surged more often, but lasted for shorter periods, leaving exhaustion behind. Ammunition levels reached critical thresholds. Riflemen counted rounds obsessively. Machine gun belts were broken down and redistributed. Grenades were kept close, not as weapons of choice, but as last resort tools should the perimeter be breached. The platoon no longer discussed if an assault might come, only when and from where. 2 men became non-effective, not from wounds, but from exposure. Their hands could no longer operate weapons reliably. They were reassigned to internal tasks, carrying supplies, assisting the wounded, maintaining watch lists. This reduced immediate combat power, but preserved manpower in roles that still mattered. The perimeter itself contracted. Positions that required constant vigilance but offered limited control were abandoned deliberately. This was not retreat in the traditional sense, but consolidation. Overlapping fields of fire improved as distances shortened. The cost was reduced warning time. If an assault came, it would be closer before detection. The consequences of holding were cumulative. No single moment marked failure or success. Instead, each hour added strain to bodies already operating beyond sustainable limits. Survival was no longer measured by tactical advantage, but by whether the platoon could remain coherent enough to respond to whatever came next. They were still holding. But the margin that allowed them to hold was narrowing rapidly. When German pressure eased, it did so without announcement. Probing patrols became less frequent. Sounds of movement shifted farther away. The forest did not become safe, but it became quieter in a way that suggested attention had moved elsewhere. The platoon did not interpret this as victory. They interpreted it as uncertainty. Reduced pressure could mean a delayed assault, a change in priorities, or a simple redirection of forces. They maintained discipline, kept watch, and avoided unnecessary movement. Relief arrived not as a coordinated operation, but as a gradual reappearance of the larger system. Distant artillery fire signaled shifting lines. Then unfamiliar voices carried through the trees. Finally, elements of an American unit moved cautiously into the area, weapons raised, unsure of what they would find. The platoon's extraction was slow and deliberate. Wounded men were evacuated first. Those able to walk assisted those who could not. No one moved quickly. The risk of accidental engagement or collapse due to fatigue remained high. At higher headquarters, the platoon's survival registered as a minor data point. Reports noted resistance encountered. Timelines were adjusted slightly. There was no immediate doctrinal shift. The system absorbed the anomaly and moved on. Medical staff documented cold injuries, malnutrition, and exhaustion. Recovery took weeks for some. Others returned to duty sooner, though their capacity was reduced. The experience left no visible mark on operational planning documents. Informally, the story circulated among nearby units. Not as legend, but as reference. A reminder that isolation did not always end immediately, and that survival depended as much on restraint as aggression. The system did not change because of this platoon, but individuals within it took note. Small adjustments were made quietly, in how supplies were packed, how radios were protected, how expectations were managed when plans failed. The platoon itself ceased to exist as a distinct entity within weeks, reassigned and redistributed as replacements filled gaps elsewhere. Its experience was not preserved as a lesson in any manual, but it remained present in the memories of those who had lived inside that shrinking perimeter long after the forest was behind them. Years later, the location where the platoon held its position appeared unchanged. Trees had grown thicker. Snow still settled into the same shallow depressions. There was no marker to indicate what had happened there, no sign that men once counted minutes in that forest while waiting for a decision made far beyond their reach. On paper, the platoon had delayed enemy movement briefly. It had survived until the broader situation stabilized. Its contribution was measured in hours and annotated in footnotes. What the records do not show is how survival unfolded moment by moment, shaped by cold, scarcity, and restraint rather than dramatic action. The outcome was not the result of a single decision, but of hundreds of small ones made under pressure, most of which left no trace once the situation passed. The system that failed them eventually returned, adjusted just enough to reclaim the ground. The men moved on, carrying injuries that healed unevenly and memories that rarely aligned with the simplicity of official summaries. In the end, the platoon did not hold because it was ordered to do so, or because it expected recognition. It held because leaving was worse, because staying made sense for one more hour, and because discipline persisted after hope narrowed. If stories like this, quiet, factual, and grounded in the realities of war, matter to you, consider subscribing to the channel to support our team and help ensure these histories continue to be told.